So we're going to go ahead and get started. So this last panel, of course, on scholar activism and social community engagement. These are long-standing issues in the field, and how could you not have a panel to discuss these questions? And we have quite a panel for you. This panel will be led by my colleague, Elizabeth Hinton. I am sad to say, will be heading to Yale, but Yale has managed to pull her away, but only temporarily. We don't lose people easily, and even if we do, we bring them back, and we're already working on that. So don't get too comfortable at Yale. Obviously, Elizabeth's a great scholar of the prison system, policing, and the criminal justice system in America in general, and a real rising star, has influenced the field, opened up new pathways and conversations around these questions. We greatly admire her. I learned a ton from her work, and I feel very comfortable with this panel in her very capable hands. Please welcome Elizabeth Hinton.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Tommy. It's really thrilling and an honor to be here celebrating a department that is a part of my heart and that I love very dearly. I became a scholar because I wanted to change the world, and because I believe that research, that intellectuals have really important contributions to make to liberation struggles and struggles for freedom. And I know we have an interdisciplinary panel up here, but I followed Malcolm X, who said that history is best qualified to reward our research, and chose to become a historian to understand the past in order to study the past to create a better present and future. And I was trained at Columbia University and worked with Manning Marable. And and Zahir Ali, who's also here with us, would tell you, Manning always talked to us about this great department at Harvard and what was being built here. And AAAS is kind of a model for what African American studies could be, and especially Skip and Skip's work in terms of broadening public engagement with African American studies. And so, of course, always feeling this kind of urgent need to not do history for history's sake, to not do scholarship just for other scholars, but to change the world. Of course, I was absolutely thrilled when I had the opportunity to join this renowned department. Being a part of a faculty where so many wonderful ideas have emerged and are kind of shared with the public, it's not just about us, but about this vision of changing the world, has been a place where my scholarship has thrived, my student scholarship has thrived, and people around the world become inspired to change their own circumstances. So we're going to ask some of these big questions today. I know that we've had a lot of fruitful discussions over the past 2 days about African American studies, about this department, but what are the implications of the work that we do? And we have extremely renowned and inspiring panelists who are doing phenomenal work in the world that I hope we will have a rich engagement of, and that will inspire all of us to go out there and make social change. So I am going to introduce all of them very briefly. I encourage you to look to the program for their full bios, which are their accomplishments are too numerous to name up all at once up here. And we're going to go in order of the program. So first we'll hear from Carol Boyce Davies, who is a professor of English and Africana Studies at Cornell University, followed by Harvard alum Amani Perry, who received her JD from Harvard Law School and a PhD in the history of what was then American civilization from Harvard. And Imani Perry is the Hughes Rogers Professor of African American Studies and Faculty Associate in the program in Law and Public Affairs and Gender and Sexuality Studies at Princeton. Next, we'll hear from Aurora Vergara Figueroa, who's the director of the Afro-Diasporic Studies Center at ISI University. And finally, and perhaps he needs no introduction, we will hear opening remarks from my dear colleague, Cornell West, who is who among many other things is professor of the practice of public philosophy at Harvard University, who's and jointly appointed in AAAS, in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, and the Divinity School. And the way this is going to work, I'm just going to open up and invite all of our panelists to kind of just reflect for a bit about their own work, and then we'll have a moderated discussion, and then perhaps most importantly, we really want to have a dynamic conversation with everybody in this room. Again, really kind of taking away from this conference, what are the implications of the work that we do, and especially in this moment that we're now in, as literally the Black primary is happening in South Carolina, what is our responsibility to create a different kind of world and lead to social transformation? So first, I'd like to invite the panelists to share with us a little bit about how you define scholar activism, how this vision has shaped your own work, and how you see yourself as committed to advancing social justice goals. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I want to say thank you to your unit, your department, for holding the fort for 50 years. This is amazing. I'm sure when you started, there was no sense that this would be the day that you said 50 years of all this excellence. Congratulations. And Skip needs to hear this publicly. Years ago, I was a prophet at Binghamton University, but I would go back and forth to Cornell all the time. And one day my car broke down. I had two little girls at the time. They were like 5 and 7 or whatever. And I didn't know what to do, but I had met Skip and I had his number. I phoned him and he came right away down to the middle of campus where I had broken down. So my daughters think you are like the amazing rescuer. And then later they saw you as, wow, this is a really famous person who appears on TV all the time, but they know you as the person who rescued them when we had that car breakdown. I thank you for that. I wanted to publicly acknowledge that so they know that. Okay, so we had thanks to Elizabeth, some really nice generating questions. And the first one, of course, has to do with talking about ourselves in relation to what we do and how we come to do what we did. For me, I made a few notes, of course, as I'm sure all of us did. But for me, as a Caribbean American born in Trinidad and Tobago, and I say this with no offense to Harvard, but for many of us, Howard was the place to go to, actually, not Harvard. And people knew Harvard, and it was not a mistake of names. It was just that this was the place, particularly because people like our Prime Minister, Eric Williams, had taught at Howard. And actually, John Hope Franklin, who I met, subsequently told me he shared an office with Eric Williams. So we already had that sort of relationship from those two major figures from the start. But for me as a Caribbean American, one has a variety of choices as one lives some form of the African American experience in the United States. One of them can be the identification or creation of small or large enclave-like communities with no serious relationship to the dominant society, perhaps through work, church, or occasional meetings, carnivals, as we love to create them everywhere we go. But perhaps this comfortable of roots for the immigrant allows him or her to build his own type of cultural and social community in the face of the dominating American ideologies which all of us struggle with. But another option, the one that I like, the one that I work with, is to work in terms of communities of struggle, those communities and relationships that see themselves as consciously allied for the advancement of the entire Black population globally. This is the model created by Caribbean Pan-Africanists and internationalists ahead of me, and the one that I embrace. Definitely, particularly since we already have a definable Caribbean radical intellectual tradition, part of that large-scale Black intellectual tradition. So I think as we celebrate Harvard's 50 years, we still have to recognize, and again, I'm bigging up Howard University, where I got a master's in African Studies. My prof then, P.Ch. Onwachi, who was the director of African Studies then, would always talk about Leo Hansberry and actually say that anything named from Cornell's African Studies should be named after Hansberry. I recognize Professor Ephraim Isaacs and his work in Ethiopia, particularly since Hansberry had gotten his degree here at Harvard, but then went to Howard and was the person who actually mentored and taught Azikiwe and Nkrumah, and the last speaker in Nkrumah's name came up several times. So the fact that Hansberry taught Nkrumah is resonant again in the kind of work that is indicated in what the vision was for Pan-Africanism in general, but of course the intellectual projects that were identified earlier. And the fact that Hansberry is Lorraine Hansberry's uncle, and I had emailed Imani about that to get a little bit more detail, and I quickly looked at her book, but I didn't see a lot about Hansberry, but he's indicated there. But the fact of Hansberry offering African civilizations courses pushes back the boundaries of what we define as when African studies starts in the United States, and makes us really want to recognize his work. And I think Harvard should really probably have some sort of recognition of Hansberry's contribution to the development of African studies. So the knowledge of his African studies was so vast, it seems, that he was unable to obtain his PhD here because they indicated that there was nobody qualified to professor him or mentor him and so on. And I was also troubled by the fact that Alain Locke was one of the people who, with another professor, spent time saying that Hansberry was working out of a field that he had not really documented substantially. And of course, he had to defend himself and all of that. But Hansberry was so significant that Ezekwe offered to underwrite his publication called The Rise and Decline of the Ethiopian Empire. Hansberry is, of course, significant for me for the fact that I worked on Claudia Jones, who roomed with Lorraine Hansberry at one point during their time at Harlem. For me then, going to Howard University at the time that I did, it was an amazing engagement with actually being on a campus where one saw on a day-to-day basis people like C.L.R. James, where one saw Sterling Brown in the library. I used to work in Founders Library, where Stephen Henderson's office was upstairs in African American Studies. Stephen Henderson wrote Understanding the New Black Poetry, who somehow disappeared from a lot of consideration. Leon Damas of Negritude fame was my thesis advisor. On campus, John O'Killens, Hakeem Adubuti was there. Dorothy Porter ran the Moreland Spingarn Research Library. Poet Ethelbert Miller worked upstairs in the African American Studies Library. And Founders Library, where I worked, was the site where Caribbean students stood in front of the library talking and cursing about what was going on back in the Caribbean. At C.L.R. James' class, one day a friend told me I should come to the class. I was a literature major, but I would go to the class because it was Pan-Africanism. He said, there's a woman who's going to be speaking in our class. It was Sylvia Wynter. Hello, Howard University, HU. From Leon Damas, I heard amazing stories of his encounters with Langston Hughes and life in Paris. My African-American lit prof was Arthur P. Davis, editor of Cavalcade, then the preeminent source of African-American literature, and so on. So I'm saying all of this to say that my Black intellectual self is shaped by those early moments of Black self-articulation, but also subsequently the work of Black women's studies and the rise of Black feminisms in the United States, and definitely the work of Black left activism and a variety of other intellectual traditions to which we belong. But specifically for me, what I will term then a Black feminist intellectual tradition has to be identified more specifically and separately, if we can, which has to me as a task challenging male privilege, which for me is just as insidious as white privilege. For me, it is an understanding of how these privileges are layered when operating with a claim to innocence as they operate with the entrenched and sedimented operations of masculinity and whiteness, which come together in really bizarre and difficult ways for Black women, intellectual scholars. Cite Black women. I have more, but I'll pause so my colleagues can get to the discussion.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
Before I begin in earnest, I just want to say that it's an incredible gift for me personally to be here. It's a rare occasion where you can be in a room with your teachers and mentors and beloved people and mentees and friends and people with whom I am currently working on projects, and even someone who knew me when I was a 6-year-old voracious reader. So I'm just incredibly grateful for this gathering, and of course for this department, because even though I didn't graduate from it, I did. Also, happy extra day of Black History Month.
Yes.
Right? So I just want to make a few observations. I don't identify myself as a scholar activist, not because I think of that as somehow less than important and virtuous, but because I take the role of activists and organizers very seriously. And I remember when I was early in graduate school, I asked Farrah Griffin, like, you know, what should I do about this thing? Because I feel like I'm not in the streets, and what am I doing? And she said, it's okay to see your work as being a scholar. And that was a really profound moment for me. So one of the things I think is important is to keep in mind that Black studies, in all of the successive stages of its development, really from the 19th century forward, if we think about it as sort of having an important foundation even prior to its entry into higher education, has had both a political and moral imperative attached to it, either explicit or implicit. To be concerned with, on the one hand, the liberation of Black people, of course, but also an epistemological insurgency and urgency, born from the encounter with the ages of conquest, the transatlantic slave trade, and more generally modernity, right? The period in history where people of African descent first became Black. So I think of that there's something embedded in the field that is significant, and it's part of why I found myself here, right, in the field. But I also think of, to a large extent, my training in both the undergraduate and graduate level and subsequent reading of and critical theory as having, for me, a role of thinking about what all of that means today, right? To do scholarship somehow in the service of. That is to say, the critical function as being applied to some investments, right? Some values about how the world might be or should be, right? And there's a sense in which this is a revelation that can potentially make you feel vulnerable, because the posture many scholars have is that of the imperial objective scholar. Right? But the fact is, there are always ideological commitments. Right? We had a reference to classics earlier. There's lots of ideological commitments in that field by and large. And so I think there's a value around this question to being transparent about ideological commitments, but also to understand the risks associated with those commitments, right? And to think about how we protect ourselves from those overtaking the seriousness of our work, right? And to protect against the potential impulse to be driven by our passions uncritically. The tool that we need is rigor, right? And that's what we've been talking about in many ways in the conversations about methods and the conversations about what interdisciplinarity means, about what kind of training we need to have, is that it is particularly the case when one is talking about the liberation of people that you need rigor, right? It's even more important because these are difficult questions to answer, and one is often pushing against dominant modes of interpretation, right? So for me, both my work and also how I try to train students is to shed the mythology of the imperial objective scholar and insist upon the seriousness of inquiry. And then I think just a few other things. One is, I think, for me, it also means that, to be honest, as a faculty member at Princeton, I understand that I am a part of the engine of social class reproduction, right, and sustaining the status quo, right? And as such, right, I think to be a person of conscience in this career demands a commitment to disruption of some of that, right? So that at the very least I can try to undo the ways that I participate in the injustice, right? And I think that happens in numerous ways. Obviously, it happens in the work itself and what the work does and what the work opens up. But I also think a lot about how students are witnesses to our commitments and priorities and what and who we read and how, where we rest our attention, And for me, just autobiographically, right, being here was central to me as a place that made space for me to imagine my work as having meaning in the world, right? And so trying to provide that for subsequent generations is a good part of what I'm trying to do. And before I stop talking, I do though want to raise a couple of challenges, I think, for the role of the scholar activist or the scholar of political who has political consciousness, or the scholar who wants to do something to impact or change the world in significant ways that I think are worth drawing attention to today in this weird age that we live in. So one, there has been, in large part really because of this department, a recognition over the past several decades, I finished exactly 20 years ago, is one of the challenges that, okay, so there was a skepticism towards reaching out to the public, I think, in the academy, right? For a long time, there's something that this department did to show that one could simultaneously pursue serious scholarly work of the highest level and also speak beyond the university. And really the simultaneity of that was incredibly important. I think we now live in what I refer to as an attention economy, right? And I do think that it is constantly threatening, particularly for younger scholars or kind of in between people like me. It threatens to distort one's commitment to having a critical disposition to the world, because the critical disposition often puts one at risk for retaliation or criticism, particularly if you say things that aren't popular, or you say things that aren't popular for being a member of your particular group, okay? And so I think sort of to the extent that we can talk about that, I think that's a really important pressing concern. And another complicated challenge is being critical within the very structure of the university. And particularly insofar as, one has to make assessments of how one intervenes in things like the casualization of labor, right? All kind of sources of vulnerability. The relationship between universities to its most sort of vulnerable members, staff and food workers, student organizers, and the like. Understanding that not simply as a question of self-interest. Like I remember when we had students protesting and they would be like, okay, do you have tenure? Can you help us, right? And I'd be like, that's not really the calculus for me. My calculus is that if I want to be part of this community over the long term, one does have to make decisions about how one intervenes in the dynamic relationship between being a member, becoming a trusted part of the community, and how one makes a kind of intervention that might have an impact beyond the immediate moment, right? And those are kind of complicated questions that I think because of, that we often have trouble thinking about. And then I guess the very last thing that I'll say is, so there's obviously a great deal of kind of competitiveness in the academy, particularly as the stakes are so high and there's relatively few jobs. And I do think perhaps if we can find in Black Studies a way to sort of remain invested in the sort of foundational principles of the field, we can figure out ways to be kind of meaningfully collaborative and in community instead of in constant competition.
Good afternoon. I would like to start thanking the organizers of this event for inviting me to be part of the celebration. Professor De La Fuente, thank you for suggesting my name. Professor Gates, Professor Shelby, thank you. And thank you for this wonderful panel. I'm really thrilled to be here with you. So first, a disclaimer. English is not my first language. I was speaking Spanish 2 days ago. I will be doing the same thing tomorrow. So I just hope that the English speaking ship is working so that I can communicate.
It's working.
Keep going.
You're very well. That is the truth.
So there will be some photos passing by of the region called Bohaya in Chocó, where I do research. And I am from the state of Chocó, not from this particular community, but from this state. So I have conducted engaged ethnography, mainly in the rural areas of the Colombian Pacific coast. My work started in Bohaya, in the state, and in this community, there was a horrendous massacre on May 2nd, 2002. More than 100 people were killed. 44 of them were children. This happened at a community in which 95% of 10,000 people live with their basic needs unsatisfied. Traveling to Bohaya for over 15 years has helped me to set the foundation to conceptualize scholar activism and community engagement. So working with these women, the survivors of the massacre, and with their children and families, I have learned that scholar activism is a commitment to writing stories of dignities, to challenge epistemological silencing, and to promote social justice. I started doing research at this community because I was celebrating my quinceañera, and I was not able to celebrate due to the massacre. And when I went to college, a historian told me, I remember that there was another massacre at the same community. So I went to the archives, and I learned that in the 20th century, in the 19th century, in the 18th century, in the 17th century, and in the 16th century, there were systematic events of violence and killings and disappearance in the same piece of land. So I went back to review the literature to see were they conceptualizing these type of experiences. As you'll see in the map, Bohaya is located in a very strategic location. So travelers from the Dutch Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Spaniards have been traveling there. Sensitive documents about gold trade and different negotiations on the land, I found it here in the United States, not in Colombia. So this piece of land has been very important for the world economy. When I look at the literature, they will call the experiences of these people forced migration or forced displacement, and I realized that that is not enough. So I decided to propose and bring to the literature categories such as diaspora, deracination, and deterritorialization into the equation to account for the historical complexities of land grabbing and land dispossession. So I developed this methodology combining archival historical analysis with ethnography. And the women of this community have been central to the analysis. So thinking about scholar activism and engaging community, for me, is centering the voices of Black women. This practice should be a life ethic, and I take it as a life ethic, and it should lead us to build long-term relationships with the communities with which we collaborate, so that we can contribute to the improvement of their lives. When I finished my graduate thesis and I went to create this Afro-Diasporic Studies Center, we created a project that we now call Voices of Resistance. And with this project, what we're doing is we are creating this documentary film series in which we portrayed silenced and oppressed groups, mainly of Black women, showcasing their leadership and creating new categories that we can bring back to the mainstream debates. So I constantly go to Sweden, and I come to the United States, I go to Ghana, so that we can talk to scholars about these categories that can inform our literature. So learning from Bohaya, I conceptualize a scholar activist as someone who turns silence into writing, and these writings create new narratives, because the stories of these women did not exist for the literature, and now we learn from them a lot. A scholar activist challenges discourses and practices that turn the spaces that Black people inhabit into laboratories of death. So after doing this historical research, I found that the only category that can help me to understand why they keep killing systematically Black people in the same piece of land is to use the category of geography of death or laboratory of death, so that we can see how we make life in these spaces that are designed for people to not leave. And you can see how much they had to do to survive in this territory. Joy Giovanna Thank you for insisting. This is the reason why I was not answering your questions and your emails. I was so hard to reach me because I was doing research. So that's the reason. Sorry, it was so hard to get to me, but thank you for insisting. And thank you for the whole staff for everything that you did to get me here. So, scholar activists torn laboratories of data with our research, and we turned it into territories of resistance and growth with the community we work with. And so far, we're working on 5 projects at CEAF, the Center for Afro-Diasporic Studies. There was the book on Bohaja, and you will not believe how beautiful it was, reading with the women the book, written in English. We will say it, and I will read the book, I will translate the book. And they'll say, no, read it in English. I don't understand by my words in English. Listen, they sound so good. So I want to see what is it that they're going to listen when you tell my story. And going back to the river and reading the chapters with them, it took me hours, but it was so fulfilling because they say, yes, I agree with you. That's important. But you know what? You go publish the book and come back. We need to work on the school. We need to work on the hospital. We need to work on the things that are going to help us to survive. So go along with your book. You are approved to publish it, but then you return with students. We're going to get the work done. So with Roses of Resistance, we were able to record several of their stories, and children, teenagers will help us to collect the stories. And we developed this methodology that while they are writing, we correct the writing, and when we evaluate the results, those children that are part of the projects of Voices of Resistance increase the school scores by 30%. So we know now how to do it. So we bring it into the project, and we are able to get them to school later on. So we know the math of how to do that. And this project is fully funded by Ford Foundation, and we are really thankful for their support. Another project is I Demand My Freedom, an edited volume with my colleague Carmen Cosme, in which we publish stories of Black women who went to court in the 18th century of Nueva Granada, Colombia, to demand their freedom. The project that generated this book has a collection of over 20,000 photos of the files dating to the 16th century. And this is a marvelous repository because we can see stories of women that ended up in Colombia going to court and demanding their freedom. The stories are beautiful. And the other project is Decolonializing Worlds. It's an anthology of the 20th century scholarly publications by Afro-Colombians, intellectuals. And with this anthology, we put together the main contributions of Afro-Colombian intellectuals to disciplines such as social sciences, humanities, and arts. And the last project is one that we just started with Alejandro de la Fuente. We're putting together an state-of-the-art of the Afro-Colombian studies with Alejandro and Angelica, and we are trying to bring the contributions of Afro-Colombian women intellectuals into the story of this field. So I'm going to leave it like that to answer this question, and then I get to other ideas in the next questions. So thank you.
Oh, it's so powerful, indeed. As I said yesterday, though, these 2 days have just been full of unbelievable joy for me. I think of that wonderful line in Sister Imani's magnificent letter to her sons at the very end. She says, witness to the joy and the wound. And she's talking about a tradition, and I've been very blessed to be a very small part of a great tradition of one of the grandest peoples of modern times, who used to be called Negroes. We ex-Negroes now. We New World Africans. Because I am who I am because somebody loved me. It was Clifton and Irene West. It was Clifton and Cynthia and Cheryl. It was Reverend Cook of Shiloh Baptist Church. Sarah Ray, my vacation Bible school teacher. That I accrued debts to them that I could never, ever repay, and it has nothing to do with duty, nothing to do with obligation whatsoever. It became a way of life when you're loved in that way. Then you discover in a white supremacist civilization that you hate it. And that's a Key Sweat moment. Something just ain't right. Somebody's lying. With that kind of mendacity, there's probably some criminality. At 6 or 7 years old, I was coming into consciousness and an awakening. How could I be loved so? How could I have so much worth and value? How could I get to Harvard and be loved by Preston Williams and Martin Keels and Eugene Rivers and so forth, and yet all these other folk hating me so. I said, I got to come to terms with a contradiction here. And I said to myself, first and foremost, it meant that if I love myself and I love others, then I hate the fact they're being treated unjustly, and I loathe the fact they're being treated unfairly. And I want to be faithful unto death and trying to pursue veritas in regard to their plight and predicament. And the condition of truth is always to allow suffering to speak. So it began on the chocolate side of town for me, but it spilled over. Because I learned that in Shiloh too. Hesed, that genius of Hebrew scripture. That steadfast love you spread to orphan, widow, fatherless, motherless, persecuted, and subjugated. So that becomes then a sense of a certain kind of calling, as it were. So before I arrived at Harvard, I was already fortified. I knew what I was called to do. I'm just looking for forms of weaponry. I'm looking for intellectual weaponry. I'm looking for social analysis. I'm looking for conversation with voices of the past who've already dealt with circumstances far beyond me, because I'm not a genius. I'm just brother off the block trying to bear witness to the love that I encountered with Irene and Cliff in Family and Company. You see. So as soon as I got here to Harvard, I went straight to Black Panther Breakfast Program, straight to Norfolk Prison, Providence. I went straight to Mount Pleasant Baptist Church, became head of Sunday school superintendent, then became head of Students Association of Black Students with Kevin Mercadale, trying to fuse the life of the mind with a certain way of being in the world. That's all. Now, granted, I never took one course in African American studies the whole time. My whole life, I never took one course. The only course I did take from this dear brother right here on African philosophy. And it was in African American studies, but we did African philosophy. And you gave me an A. I appreciate that too. Oh yeah, I appreciate that. But when people say, well, yeah, but you're an Afro-American scholar, you concerned? Yes, I love black people, and I'm looking for any form of weaponry that would accent their self-respect and self-determination in regard to both children and grandparents and their future. And therefore, I'm trying to look for ways of understanding and interpreting it. If that means I'm an Afro-American scholar, call me what you want. Get it in the classroom, get it out of the classroom. I don't care. The question is whether it's gone through me, not whether I went through the classroom. You see. So when I first got the call to be head of Black Studies, I mean, it was Toni Morrison who said, honey, let's create an intellectual neighborhood in Princeton. You know, that voice just, I'd never leave New York. But I said, but Toni, and then Ruth was on the phone, I've never taken one course in Afro-Americans. That's all right, you part of tradition. That's all I need to hear. All I need to hear, Skip Simmons, the same thing. Saying the same thing. But what it meant was that lo and behold, you see, we have a tradition that has set such high standards. I mean, Harriet Tubman, what would you say? I'm loving the people. I'm going back down again to get some more because I love them. Ida B. Wells, what would you say? I'm teaching Sunday school and fighting American terrorism and lynching, and I've got to refortify myself intellectually, morally, spiritually to do it again. Brother Malcolm, what would you say? Be suspicious of folk who say they respect you if they don't respect your brothers and sisters on the block, because you could easily get used in a certain kind of way. That's Malcolm. And that's just three voices. We ain't even got to Mary Lou Williams of Coltrane yet, which is the highest levels in terms of our musicians, because the musicians have always been the source of inspiration for me in setting the real standard of what it means to love people, to empty themselves at the deepest level so that their very presence is a sign that black folk gonna be empowered rather than put down. And that's what black intellectuals need to be. When they see black intellectuals, they ought to just look at black intellectuals like look at black musicians and say, they gonna empower me. They concerned about me. They gonna touch my soul. They gonna unsettle my mind. Now, last point I wanna make, and then we turn it over, is this, that we are now celebrating, and rightly so, these 50 years, and I'm just looking at Skip, brings tears to my eyes, brother, because we've been through some mess. We've been through struggles together, and I love this brother unconditionally. But we got to recognize that this golden age that we're talking about coincides with a catastrophic age for black, poor, and working people.
Yep.
You see. So there's nothing wrong with being honest about how much we support each other and affirm each other critically. But at the very moment when you get the expansion of the black professional class and unprecedented opportunities, you get unprecedented mass incarceration. You get unprecedented redistribution of wealth from poor and working people to the well-to-do. You get the financialization of our capitalist economy, where Wall Street is now in the driver's seat. You get the consolidation of surveillance and a national security state in terms of the American empire. So that our struggle becomes, how do we not become simply more colorful folk within these deep hierarchies that are reproducing the very thing that the masses revolted against in order to create black studies. You see? And that's just being true to those who came before. You see? And it's not a question of feeling as if we ought to have some guilt complex. You see, the black bourgeoisie has such a tenuous identity. It's true that somehow if we're not patted on the back, must be somebody who's planning to take us down. You see, no, it's true. No, Skip and I and the others, this is the triumph of a certain slice of the black bourgeoisie who come out of the black masses because of the masses struggling, who arrive in a site of ruling class formation in the American empire called Harvard, and we say exactly what James Baldwin said to Lorraine Hansberry. Never confuse doing well with keeping the faith. Remember that distinction she makes? You point that out in your wonderful book. And that is the niece of Leo Hansberry, the genius from the south side of Chicago herself.
And Mississippi before that.
I think she's from Tennessee.
No, Leo's from Mississippi.
Oh, Leo's from Mississippi, yeah. Because Lorraine's from Mississippi, Tennessee. Yeah, that's right. Oh, these scholars, I love it. No, because the thing about it, see, when we love each other, we protect, we respect, and we correct each other. That's what it's all about. That's what Lift Every Voice is all about. That's the anthem of black people. You lift your voice, not lifting your echo and just be an extension of some echo chamber. You got to find out who you are, think for yourself, and learn how to love for yourself. Don't ask for nobody's permission as to who you love. That's crucial. And it seems to me that what we have now is a situation at Harvard University, which was not designed by the designers of Harvard. It was not designed by the folks who's coming at Ephraim all the time. We know you've been treated unfairly and unjustly, brother. This is probably a tribute to you. Oh, that's true. Oh, no, you've heard it over and over again. But at the same time now, we're going to use your witness as one of the sources of how we take off, especially the younger generation. You see what I mean? That's the crucial thing. That's true for all of us. We use Skip's, we use mine, and so forth and so on. And it's not unanimity. It's not ideological, political unanimity. That's not what it is. It's about us being true to ourselves to the degree to which we're able to bear witness to a quest for truth, love, and justice, and then pass it on to the next generation. And I think when we look at this contrasting age, golden age, catastrophic age, unbelievable breakthrough, emerging neo-fascism.
For sure.
Well, no, it's still in process, though. But you're right. It's. I hear you. You know. So then the question becomes, how do we become more fortified? No one of us are messiahs. We're not going to stop it. We couldn't create the Afro-American Studies Department, but by one person. It was a group of collective insurgency working with one another. We had elites on the inside who were cooperating with us. You must have conflict within the ruling class to have any kind of serious breakthrough. Because there's some folk with integrity and decency, even folk who have a whole lot of money. Now, that's not dominant. No, it isn't, you know. The love of money is real. Cupidity is real. That's true for all of us. You see. But then the question becomes, how do we wrestle inside of ourselves that same cupidity, venality, callousness, indifference toward poor black brothers and sisters as we ascend to new status and then attempt to use whatever gifts we have in a form of kenosis, in a form of emptying ourselves together, critically, mediated with respect. And that's what has been so very important about this department. I think I see Brother Wilson here. He understands. We've always had respect for each other, even when we had deep disagreements. Why? Because in the end, there's something so much bigger that we all wrestling with, which is this suffering and misery and poverty and this vision of something being better, tied to the true, the good, the beautiful, and myself as a Christian, tied to the holy too, you see. And I think that process has joy. And the moment you no longer find joy in your struggle, you will become a truncated professional. Just doing it for the career, doing it for the job, doing it for the cash. And that joy has nothing to do with ephemeral pleasure. Because capitalist culture is a joyless quest for insatiable pleasure. Get all the pleasures in the world, don't have no joy. Well, that's part of the spiritual malnutrition that is haunting this nation and haunting Black America. We have never, as a Black people, been a people so spiritually empty. Come on, say it now. In terms of looking for pleasure and afraid of the joy, because joy always goes with, Frankie Beverly's right.
Pain.
Joy and pain. If you want a painless, comfort-oriented, convenient life, you ain't gonna have no joy. You're just gonna have pleasure. And it's gonna lead you into a dead end, but I don't want to start preaching. No, I'm gonna stop right there. Stop right there.
Thank you all for those incredibly fruitful and generative reflections. So I want to pick up on kind of where Cornell ended up, but a point that Amani raised about the fact that we are, as Black scholars and sitting here in this very nice lecture room at Harvard, part of the engine, as Amani said, of social class reproduction. So all of you touched on this question in one way or another in your opening remarks, but I want to think about it a little bit more concretely in terms of what relevant connections exist or should exist between our field of Black studies and ongoing struggles against injustice outside of the academy. So what is our relationship as Black scholars to Black people, not just in the US, but around the world, across the diaspora? So I'll invite anyone to jump in. You don't have to go in line.
Yeah, I was, example I had take note of was the little girl, 6 years old, got arrested, handcuffed, and I think the police officer was a Black man. Right. There's something really sick in the society if that can happen. And so immediately I went back to, I had done a master's in international law, the Convention on the Rights of the Child. The U.S. is one of 3 countries that never signed it. So we need to provide that kind of, the only other 2 countries are Somalia and Sudan, I believe. We need to provide that kind of documentation so our communities understand what's going on. In other words, the U.S. goes around the world talking about democracy, trying to tell everybody else their democracy is not working. And here you have probably the worst functioning pattern of governmental practice that I've seen in a long time. And I think we have to begin there to look at the dysfunctions in our communities and then see how we as intellectuals can provide the knowledge, can provide the assistance, can provide analyses, can provide, all of the ways that we talk to our people and let them know what's going on and share and learn from them too, because it's not one way. So I so agree with you, that point. There's a phrase that Sylvia Winter uses about the fact that we in these institutions are actually part of that whole process of maintaining and creating a system that also disempowers our communities. So we have to find ways to understand how we can unlock that and how we can reject that and move away from that and then challenge us to move further. I also wanted to say, people like Walter Rodney, I really wanted to put back Walter Rodney on the table, definitely, and make sure you all get The Groundlings with My Brothers, the new version. Because Walter Rodney and the Caribbean intellectuals who I learned from and have learned from was the kind of person who put himself out to really try to transform community, and I want to at least recognize him in this kind of context, the kind of work, without us being martyrs, of course, but definitely ways of saying, how do we undo some of the ills that our societies, have received over the years. And I love your work, what you're doing in Colombia. That is just brilliant. Thank you for doing that.
I actually think about your work because, part of the answer to the question is doing the kind of work that helps us understand the structures of injustice at a deep and sophisticated level, so that no one can offer, after you've written that book, a simple story of the rise of mass incarceration just as a conservative backlash against the movement, right? And so now we know the words, the language, the types of interventions that have a pretty bow on them, but in fact are ways to extend surveillance, right, over Black communities that continue, right? I think that the question is for the work to be meaningful. And I also think a piece of it, and this is also, it's related to many people's work in this room, is to understand that, I feel like before I got here, I felt like I was constantly, my earlier education, being told that a connection to my own experience was a kind of essentialism to avoid, right? But in fact, experiences function as sources of critical insight, right? So you go from your experiences or encounters to So, for example, when I wrote a history of Lift Every Voice and Sing, I knew that the story was not going to be in the Beinecke Library, as great as the library is, in the James Weldon Johnson papers, because I knew the ritual context in which people sang the song, right? That's a matter of existing in Black communities, right? And I think similar work, we can think about that similarly with incarceration. We can think about that in lots of ways. So I think it's, it goes back to, Cornell's point about telling the truth, but also giving a sense of value to your own experiences and sources of critical insight that actually is what facilitates doing the kind of work that becomes useful.
Thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, so racism is killing people across the globe. And there are 4.3 million people fleeing their homelands around the globe. According to the 2019 Global Report on Deracination, the number of people internally displaced by conflict and violence around the world is the highest it has ever been. This is mainly due to unresolved conflict, criminal violence, social and economic crisis, and weather-related disasters that continue to push people to flee. They say that 3/4 of this population, that is 30.9 million people, are located in 10 countries. The first 2 countries, Syria and Colombia. The main victims of this phenomenon are those who Du Bois will refer to as the darker races of the world. Such a reality needs scholarship and resources to be devoted to solving it. Otherwise, we will be only witnessing such a tragedy. We just can't afford to not conduct scholarship and resources to resolve urgent problems that African and Black people are facing around the globe. So we ought to craft a renowned vision to have a more just world. That's what I want to say about that question.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, absolutely. I don't think I have anything to add, actually.
Okay, we could. So I want to actually pick up on something else that you said, and I think we really want to try to have as much engagement with the audience as possible. So I'm going to throw a lot out and ask what I think is a big question as my final question for now, at least, which is Cornell, you pointed out that we are living, that this golden age of Black studies and Black inclusion in elite institution also coincides with this catastrophic moment for Black people. And so I want us to think about, I guess, one, to what extent we have a political responsibility in this moment, and as scholars we have a political responsibility, to what extent our scholarship should be political. And Cornell, I invite you to talk about, in a kind of literal sense of political, the work that you're doing around this election, and the work that you think that Black scholars can do around this upcoming election. And then, and this thing that's kind of near and dear to my own heart, but to what extent do we need to, and it goes back to some of what I brought up in the last question, that we have a responsibility to use our scholarship, but also the resources that we have access to towards solving some of these really urgent problems that our people are facing. So as a scholar of mass incarceration, I think it's really important that as a member of a university community, that universities also step up, and that I, as in studying the problem, also continue to fight for expanding the resources that I have access to help address that problem, and whether that's through research that's going to lead to transformative policy changes, whether that's expanding educational opportunities for people who are incarcerated. So I'd just like you to reflect, what should we, in this moment, what do we need to be doing to advance this struggle? It's not just about necessarily having conferences and talking about it, but what can our scholarship do to advance this struggle? How can we press universities to advance struggles for liberation? And, what might we do? How might we use this election, which is a really critical election for our people and our people's future, as a moment that we can, or maybe we should not, step up to becoming a really kind of prominent and influential voice in some of the most pressing debates.
Well, again, like Mandy said, I think you're a wonderful example of how you wrestled with Eric Foner and Manny Marable, and then took it to places they knew not of, but in the same tradition. Yeah. Du Bois prior to that, and so forth. I'll say the same thing about Manny, and same thing about Farrah and Brandon and Tommy and the others. And we have to stay away from this notion that there's just one model, some monolithic way of being in the world that defines what it is to be an activist. It's lift every voice. That is perspectival. A lot of it has to do with temperament. A lot has to do with vocation. Look at Ella Baker. She was at the height of activism, left the movement to take care of her niece. That's love. She had a call which was different. Then she came right back into the movement. Everybody got their situation and context. And everybody's who they are, not somebody else. But that doesn't mean we don't hold each other accountable. Now, when it comes to politics, I can say this. I think this is very important. That 2016 is one of the few moments in the history of American politics that the most progressive community in America did not support the most progressive candidate run for president in the primary. That's black folk vis-a-vis Bernie Sanders. But that's something to wrestle with. That has to do with the neoliberal seductions of a black community under centrist black leadership in a centrist Democratic Party, and a fear of a so-called democratic socialist who can never win. Now, that's understandable. That's highly plausible, thoroughly unpersuasive to me, but highly plausible. And then the legacy of our dear brother Barack Obama. Because the last thing we want to do is produce students in Afro-American studies that think that, lo and behold, the end and aim of being a black freedom fighter is to be part of symbolic representation at the top of an empire, at the top of predatory capitalism, to make the hierarchy more colorful, and then just celebrate. You're going to disarm your whole generation if that's your conception of what the measure of black progress is, when your black poor and working folk out there catching hell. Wage stagnation, decrepit school systems, guns, terrorism. We go on and on and on and on. So this is, and I'm not saying this just said, but told you so. No, because I mean, the love is constant. Well, I did. no, but I mean, that's all, But I mean, you don't love black folk to be loved back. You love them because they're worthy of being loved. There ain't a question of quid pro quo here. But now it's come back again, and people have different practical judgments. You got a whole host of folk now tied to Steyer. I just spoke in Royal Missionary Baptist Church. The head of the Black Caucus is with Steyer. Didn't even know who the man was a couple of years ago. And he's sitting there talking about this. We got a lifetime of struggle. I say, man, come on now. How much cash is really flowing? You know what I mean? What's going on here? You know, Bloomberg in some ways too. Bloomberg is complicated because you got some folk who support him and been supporting him. You got other folks supporting him who just on the gravy train. And then Skip's been misunderstood. Skip said Bloomberg can beat him, and he didn't say he's pro-Bloomberg. Is that right, Skip? That's misunderstood. Let's put that on the record.
I said in the New York Times, there are only two people who can stand toe-to-toe with Donald Trump on the debate stage, Mike Bloomberg and Bernie Sanders. That's what I think.
And they cut that out of the interview.
I don't think Mike can.
So much for the neoliberal press. but the point is this. We can have differences, we can argue and so forth, but we've got to be able to have spiritual and moral criteria in terms of saying what we mean, meaning what we say, and having some integrity in what we say. That's the crucial thing. Because once you lose that, then everything is just survival of the slickest. And it's all just cash, 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 cash. You see that?
The question about what to get the institutions to do is complicated to me because I think that those endeavors are always fugitive at best, you know, and oftentimes when one tries to put together initiatives that have some social meaning beyond the university, the question the university wants to know is this going to make students happy? Is this going to be fun for them? Right? Is this going to be an experience that they can put on their graduate school applications and not really the substance of the work? So I think that there are good things that can happen, but I think we have to be honest about, you know, the resistance to having a deep institutionalization, right? And to say in a period of years we might be able to use these resources to do something meaningful, and we probably have to pivot to the next thing soon thereafter. I must admit I have complicated feelings about national elections that are connected to my political commitments. Because anybody who becomes president of the United States is going to be deeply implicated in a lot of violence and domination all over the world and at home.
That's true.
And as a consequence, but I do think it's important to be politically engaged, right? So I think for me it's the idea of sort of being a critic who talks about the complexity of that relationship.
Yes.
For example, right? And also to, you know, I mean, I may call myself a socialist, but I also do believe deeply. It's not a but given the U.S. context, you have to say it as a but because people think that means you don't believe in democracy, which is bizarre, as though capitalism and democracy go together better. But you know, that the local is incredibly important as well. I think that, and that sort of and so in seasons like this, so often the political decisions that have an immediate impact on people's lives sort of fall out of the discussion. And I think if we can do something, years ago I wrote a piece about public intellectualism that tried to expand the term to talk about all of the kinds of interventions that scholars make, whether they do policy work for local communities, whether they're doing things with churches or in prisons or schools that often don't get counted as such. And I think that's, you know, to think in more sophisticated ways about what it means to be of service to publics, right, with the goal, in ways that are connected to one's political vision, seemed to me at least an important way of thinking about that.
Yeah, one of the things that that keeps coming back up in my head is the extent to which, and B.J. Buchanan, who used to be here or was here, talked about arrested decolonization. And I think it applies, or I see it as unfinished decolonizations. It applies in the institution and also outside as well. Because in my assessment, the universities still remain sort of very colonized spaces. We still have English departments. And I say this not just critiquing the United States, all around the world, which are not studying literature as plural, but they're named English departments. That's, I mean, yeah. So we're still operating from a very colonized location, and this is one of the benefits, it seems to me, of African American studies and African diaspora studies, African studies generally as well, at least pushing against that logic of an institution that is going to operate on the basis of a kind of colonized logic in terms of how the disciplines are represented. In almost all of the institutional contexts, they still feel comfortable to have just one faculty member of color, sometimes not at all. Sometimes one comes and leaves. And they still operate from the logic that there's a scarcity in terms of personnel possible to be working in these institutions. So for me, it's an ongoing process of challenging those logics of colonization which remain inside the United States, but also operate in other locations around the world. So I'm always gratified. For example, we're doing 50 years, a lot of 50 years. In Ngugi wa Thiong'o's on the abolition of the English department, we just celebrated 50 years of that in 2018. And I think the new universities have, in Africa, for example, and some of the Caribbean universities have moved away from having these departments so operating with a colonized logic and have moved to departments of literatures, for example, right? But still, and you mentioned, the speaker earlier spoke about Legon and Ibadan. I went to Ibadan, I need to at least say that as well. PhD in African literature from Ibadan. But those are still English departments. So my point, I'm just using that as an example to say that in spite of the fact that, and I know the panel earlier talked about the various disciplines, but they still operate with a very Eurocentric logic of what is included, what is not included, who is allowed to be part of the primary discussions, whose work is respected. Black women's work after 20, 30 years of scholarship is often not cited. That's why I raised the question earlier. So I think there's a series of processes we still have to concretely do on ourselves as well, even as we challenge the larger dominant structures politically and so on. And from the Caribbean and other locations, we feel we should around the world be voting in American elections because we are so impacted by what happens. And I've heard people say that everywhere I go, that we need, particularly in the last election cycle, how could this be? People are still in shock about how the United States could produce, at this point in history, somebody who operates without knowledge, without information, and so on. So that when Bernie says, the Cuban government's literacy program is one of the best in the world. This is fact. Right. This is true. Right. Their medical system is also fact. Their doctors go around the world and work with people in Africa. In Grenada, you can't say anything about Fidel because what they did with Chavez was take old people with cataract, who needed cataract surgeries, fly them to Cuba, did the cataract surgery, send them back to Grenada. So all these people can see because of Fidel. So you can't say any, from the Caribbean, we have a whole different read of this whole logic of how you see Cuba. So please, if nothing else is said here from me, please challenge that. Please, that's ignorance, and we can't live with that. It hurts people. People die. People can't get food. They are blocked from being able to travel, to come to the United States to get medicine. So basically, this uninformed logic that operates as normative in the United States and cultivates itself repeatedly by all kinds of ignorant assertions, even from Black people as well, has to be really challenged. And we want to say that we want to be on the front line of really interrupting those kinds of sequences of misinformation. The media needs to know what socialism is. When are they going to read? When are they going to read? And what is wrong with them? So this is a democratic socialist, Bernie. This is not a socialist in any classic sense of the word. Right. But even Joy Reid, they confuse it all the time. They would not provide correct information. They would not provide ways of us, the community understanding more fully some of the practices and policies that are operating. And this is very painful to many who live from different locations around the world and look on at this. And I'm one of them.
Well, we'd like to open it up to questions from the audience.
Oh, wow.
Professor Lewis Gates, and then we'll go to Reverend Rivers.
Thank you. This is fabulous. I do have a question, but Elizabeth, I wonder if you could share with the audience, because not everybody knows what your work is in terms of activism and relationship between, particularly, it was alluded to, the prison community and the Institute 3 years from now when you come back that you're going to found at Harvard.
So I appreciate the question, Skip. Thank you. I'll try to be really brief because I want to open it up to our distinguished panelists to talk about more about their work. But I'm a little, it's always kind of strange for me when people refer to me as a scholar activist or call me an activist. I think for some of the same reasons that Amani raised, because I don't see myself in the classical sense of doing the work on the ground and the organizing work every day. But as I mentioned, I think in considering myself a historian of U.S. inequality and doing research on the criminal justice system, I think it's irresponsible to do that work without also working towards transforming that system and working with incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people. And I also, believe that in teaching about these issues and teaching about criminal injustices, that those closest to the problem are closest not only to understanding what that system actually looks like, but also how the solution that will lead us to whatever is next when we have moved beyond the mass incarceration society that we currently live in. So again, I think that for so much of the work that we do as scholars of the diaspora, and this was mentioned in terms of the kind of political and moral imperative that we all have, but it's not just about doing the work and it's not just about researching on, but it's actually about using our scholarship to lead to social change and transformation. And I think that anybody that is not doing that or doesn't see themselves as part of that struggle, no matter what your political orientation is doing really irresponsible scholarship. So I look forward to hopefully continuing this one day. Great. Back here at Harvard.
Now, my sort of question is, in terms of lift every voice, my motto as chair of our department for 15 years was really protect every voice. I wanted to protect the right of everybody in our faculty to be themselves and to fulfill their potential, their promise, and their commitment in whatever way beyond the judgment of their peers. Because, as you know, I was a member of a heavily ideological Department of Africana Studies at Cornell. And I found it, the model to be avoided, frankly. Ideological bullying in some cases. And that's wrong. It's just absolutely wrong. And so I would stand up for the right to somebody to be anti-activism or, to be, and they could support Donald Trump, I guess. It's hard for me to say, get that out of my mouth. But I think that the only way that we can protect the integrity of our field is to combine respect with the urge. I would hope that people would hear your call. I would hope that all of us would realize that since the day this field was created at Harvard and Yale and every place else except San Francisco State in 1969, the black middle class has doubled. The black upper middle class has, Bill, quadrupled or tripled. And we got into these places because of affirmative action. And now we're professors at these places because of affirmative action. So I would like to think that it's incumbent upon us to have a commitment to the community, particularly this profound class divide within the race that makes a lot of people uncomfortable, and there are a lot of people not even willing to talk about it. However, as an administrator of a department and now research center, I think it's important to protect your right and your right and your right. If you wanted to write in your next book the history of the sonnet in the African American tradition or the history of the elegy, and it had nothing to do with quote unquote politics, that is your right to do. That, I think that we have to balance those two things. You agree with me, Corey?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, but the real hard cases, though, Brother Skip, happen to be those that go at empire, capitalism, and the connection of those two to white supremacy.
Oh, yeah.
You see, because Harvard as an institution is still tied to certain kinds of elite power. You see, so if you go directly at their source, then all of a sudden the libertarian sensibilities start getting cool, you know, ooh, Veritas, why you got to go there? Why don't you get back to those sonnets again? You see what I mean? You see what I'm saying? And this is the problem. You know, we saw this with Paul Sweezy, and he was the finest economist at Harvard. He got denied tenure because he was a Marxist. That Ray Ginger was told, you got 2 days to leave Harvard because of our relation to the U.S. government. So the sense that Harvard has always had connection to publics, it's just that it's the publics on the top, the Kissingers and others. Henry Kissinger is a great public intellectual who's happened to be a war criminal. You see what I mean? Because he was tied to the top, and then he's tied to a criminal war in Vietnam and so forth. I'm not saying to put the brother down. I'm a Christian. I love everybody. But he's a war criminal. But so the challenge is going to be those litmus tests. This is part of the discussion we had with our dear sister Garcia Pena, as to whether, in fact, it was going to be criteria. When the critique of U.S. empire gets so intense, we want to make sure she's treated fairly. And it's the same principle that you're talking about, you see. And this is true for all of us. This is true for right-wing brothers and sisters. We got a long tradition of right-wing black folk. And if they bring it and they sharp and they love the students, they got a right to be wrong at Harvard.
Reverend Rivers.
But I think Professor Eugene and then Professor Wilson.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
It's going to be Professor Wilson. I'll go after Professor Wilson.
Oh, Wilson.
You go first. All right, you hold this stuff.
Well, that's kind of Eugene.
And we'd love to also hear from some of the students in the audience. So
Absolutely.
please.
Let's hear from the students first. All right, since I have the mic, I'll go ahead. So one of the themes highlighted in this excellent panel, truly excellent panel, I appreciate. I learned some things, is using your scholarship to reinforce the struggle against racial inequality or inequality in general. And so you encourage scholars to speak beyond the university, one of the points that several of you made. I was just listening to your thoughtful comments, Professor Perry, and I was thinking about a lot of younger scholars who would love to do this, who would love to speak beyond the university, who would love to address a wider audience, but are reluctant to do so. Why? Because of fear of retaliation or criticism from senior scholars. So much so that they're even reluctant to write op-ed pieces.
Yes.
I wonder if you were to reflect more on that.
Sure. That's absolutely true. Beyond that, I have, in many instances, told my graduate students to wait on doing some of that work. Both because of the risk, but also it's good to allow yourself to be cooked a little bit. You know, because I think that there's that pressure, but there's also the attention economy. So there's forces pushing both ways, right? So one pressure is the academy that looks askance on public work for a whole host of reasons, some of which is principled, some of which is not, right? And then there's the other pressure of, you know, social media. And I got this piece in here, and I was on this, right? And I do think taking time, particularly when people are really young, to deliberate about how they want to enter into public spaces, to take time with the experience of being trained, to get a bibliography under their belt, it's not a bad thing. So that's my suggestion about how to resolve it. I'm always telling them we're not dancers, and we're not, well, basketball's not a good analogy anymore because there's some old players, but we're not athletes generally. These are long careers. You don't have to do everything right now. could build some capital, professional capital.
Yeah, now
So-
it's on, yeah.
First, I'd like to take this opportunity briefly to thank the Afro-American Studies Department and the entire project here at Harvard for its exceptional support. And this is important because this thing has been about scholarship and being black and, you know, all of that, right? I want to salute Harvard for their support of a lot of work that's been done on the ground that's not been recognized. For 20 years, much longer, I spent much of my time working with hoodlums of every conceivable variety and thugs and the rest of it. Throughout that entire period, Skip Gates, Professor Wilson actually supported a national demonstration project at Public-Private Ventures that worked with gangs in 17 different cities. And I'm not talking about dudes trying to act like gangs. I'm not talking about dudes that, you know, listened to a rap video and then went out and bought some clothes. I'm talking about the ones that was doing it. And I want to salute for the public record the extraordinary support as they provided the pedagogical and intellectual support for the ground game. And I think there's I just want, see, the scholar activist thing, I think, you know, I mean, I get it, right? But folks should play to their strengths. You know, I mean, there's a kind of romance, you know, this is kind of old 60s holdover, right? Well, I'm sort of revolutionary. No, you ain't. Stop, just stop. Be a good scholar, produce high quality scholarship, so the dudes that are in the trenches, because you're not going to do that because 90% of y'all ain't built for that. So stop fronting that. Be a scholar, write excellent books, send me 100 of them so I can take them to the jail and the Department of Youth Services and run a class for Chewy and Cornbread and, you know, Omar and what's the name, Stansfield and the rest of them. So I want to salute, for those that are guests, there has been a relationship where, and I not always, and it's amazing because we had a debate back in 1992, right? We had an interesting debate. We ain't going to get all into that, right? But there was an interesting debate about the responsibility of intellectuals. And the thing, and this is the good news now, I watched, we had an interesting debate. It scared me to death because 2,000 people showed up. Now, I know they didn't show up for me. I mean, I know it was Cordell and Skip and all them, and it was an amazing event. Now, many
Please
years
just
later.
your question.
Yeah, my question is, but no, I'm not going to back up. I was going to salute Harvard because they should be saluted, right, for what they've already done. So no, don't rush to preaching. I know,
okay, but I do want to get
I
a
understand.
student or two,
I
and
understand.
then we're almost
Let me
out of
get the
time.
question out.
Okay, thank you.
Now, my question is, gotcha. My question is, how do we get a generation of young scholar activists to go deeper in their analysis and make it more radical? Because it's left wing, but that can be boilerplate. How can we get your analysis to go deeper to address the spiritual basis of the material oppression that Professor West talks about, but the young people sleep? There you go. There's a question.
Thank you.
No, I want all y'all to answer that. No, all of y'all. No, don't dodge the question. I gave it to you. How do y'all engage this? Because that's the fundamental contradiction of your generation. Because you sleep. His point about agape love, which is going to have to be the basis for any political movement, because all the left-wing rhetoric is going to re-elect Donald Trump. I'm keeping it 100.
I think part of the challenge, though, brother, is hard for people to go to places they never been.
Yes.
I don't know what I said, but Brother Dia said for me, he understands, or Sister Dale will. No, the thing is that part of the spiritual crisis that we're talking about is gaining access to a professional guild whose distinctive features are upward mobility, success, spectacle, high visibility, that goes hand in hand with conformity, not speaking deep inside of your whole being. It's difficult to do that inside any profession, of the academy, doctors, lawyers, or so forth. So then you're going to go to professionals who are going to provide sources of you dealing with your deep spiritual life. They themselves are an evasion and avoidance of it, you see. That's why the musicians and the artists are so important. A slice of the academy. Because the academy itself is an extension of the highly commodified, professionalized site that has its own incentives for success. And success ain't got nothing to do with moral and spiritual greatness. Nothing. You got all kind of gangsters and professions at the top. Who's killing folk, murdering folk, lying on folk, dehumanizing folk, dishonoring folk. That's the history of white supremacy. I mean, much of the history of Harvard is some of the most brilliant folk reinforcing white supremacy, male supremacy, anti-Jewish, anti-Arab, that's been part of the worst of the WASP tradition. Now, you got some WASP who are critical of that, but then they had more cousins than themselves. But my point is this. What you're talking about has to do with artistry. It has to do with the collapse of our churches, the collapse of our mosques. When I say collapse, I mean the massive accommodation to spiritual malnutrition of capitalist culture. Right. That's the history of churches for the last 85, 90% of the churches, and mosques and synagogues. So where do the young folk go? Well, you see, this is a crucial question. They go to each other. Well, they go to their music. Well, where's the tenderness in their music? Where's the sweetness in their music? How come they ain't got no delphonics and emotions? You see what I mean? Something's missing. That's the sign of an empire in decay. We living in a decadent empire. That's part of our moment, given our golden age. And in our golden age, we still got a whole lot we can mobilize. And that's the point, but it's over against the grain.
Said something to me. I interviewed him recently. And he said, Elizabeth, he thinks our people are still on a freedom high from Obama.
Or freedom high.
Yeah. It's like we got drunk on the fact that there was a black president. And we
Freedom high.
Waking up from
The drunkenness yet. And there's something to it. I'm not putting it the way that he did, but that they are asleep and do not realize how much danger our community is in because of the extreme high that Barack Obama's election produced. Now, that's Andy Young's analysis, and I think there's something to that. Why wouldn't our people be lined up to vote more than even we did for Barack in the face of this, the terror that we face?
And the terrorism and the Trump.
Why? You tell me. I have no idea.
Well, can we also invite
Can I say
maybe?
something?
Yeah, please.
Yeah,
please,
just
Emma.
something. I'm sorry. This is a slightly different point, but it's related to Eugene's question because I think about the processes for young Black people to wind up in the academy, which essentially what they do now, right, in the post civil rights era, is they depend on a pulling out, right, in relation to other Black people. They depend on, in many instances, receiving a kind of favor that distinguishes you from other Black folks all along the way, right? And so I do think, so there's the loss of certain kind of institutions that bolster one in the face of that, combined with, there's something terrorizing about that, because you become someone who is deeply isolated, even if you're trying to work through all of these issues, right? And so then I think the question really falls back on us, right? How do we figure out how to nurture and sustain anew, even those of us who only got the tail end of the kind of social and institutional and associational formations that once sustained Black intellectuals. You know, you just got a little bit of it, but we have to build those anew.
There's one question.
I'd love to hear from a student up here.
Professor Hinton, there's one more.
Yes,
And the
yes.
lady in the blue has had it.
Okay.
Thank you for this forum. I really appreciate it. To my mentors, Cornell, Monty, love seeing y'all. I have a lot of questions, but I'm a contain it. I'm a contain it. I just want to speak to like this intuition I had probably since going to Morehouse College. I went to Morehouse for undergrad about Black studies in some ways being a privilege for even the Black people, Black students coming from certain communities.
Right.
And for me, I got a problem with that. I come from North Florida, plantation community, and I just think it was a true crisis that I discovered somebody like Cornel West at Morehouse. Why didn't I know about him earlier than that? Not saying that, and Cornell is one of the most famous public intellectuals there is, but I just want to get some comments on what I see. Maybe I'm wrong about a disconnect between what I call the street Black communities and the research programs that are at this day. I was just talking to Monty about this. Are growing as we speak in a way that they had never grown before, partly because of well-funded programs at places like Harvard. And so I just want to know, like, what role does public intellectualism play with that, and how can we get mend that disconnect if it is there, so that we can have more street Black people understanding this kind of scholarship that is about their own communities.
Yeah, one of the things that I have to say, and Skip is the person, everywhere you go, people pull out those videos. So the ones you did on Latin America, for example, and I think the means of educating beyond the institution, I think that's one of the models that works. But you mentioned Florida. Florida, for example, had in place, this is one of the reasons why I went there as director of a department at Florida International. They had in place a mandate, which was passed because there was an initiative by Jewish intellectuals as well to have a Jewish knowledge mandate. So there was a mandate to teach African American studies at every level, and that began there. And a few places have tried it, but essentially many locations tend to not have that opportunity for students to learn at the beginning stages. And this is not just, I mean, people are talking about Jamaica, where many people don't know about Marcus Garvey. So it's an issue that at the elementary school level, for example, how to take the curricula and shape it to make sure that we get education at every level where students are informed. So not just the freedom schools outside of the institution, but actually in those schools. And it's a challenge. But a lot of universities have been even defunding their education departments. Cornell, for example, got rid of theirs, which was quite a shock to many people. So I think that's an issue there that still has to be worked out. And I think your question really hit the nail on the head about that.
I think part of it too, we actually need to go to communities, and it takes a lot from us, but it means that, we have to go and speak to elementary schools and speak to high schools and work with community organizers who are on the ground and get hooked up with people and take the time after we're done with our day jobs to go in and do that. And I think, that requires a lot from us, but we're not going to be able to speak to communities unless we make ourselves a part of our community and start talking to people in the communities outside the academy. So, like, one way to get beyond is not just, writing the books and the op-eds, but actually spending time in the communities that we care about.
Yeah.
And that's very difficult given the responsibilities that we have at the universities and to the universities.
Army of undergrads to go out and do that.
And I should just add that this Brother D, what he's doing is a response to his own question.
Yes, indeed.
See, the Street Philosophy Institute now is not just taking off in Florida. It's a national movement. He just got back from Tanzania, though, brother? He got back from Tanzania, making connections there. He's finishing up a dissertation, 5th year in the philosophy department. You all know Elaine Locke, first PhD in philosophy. There's hardly been any other folk of color, Black folk, to go through, thanks to Tommy. Where's Brother Tommy at?
Right there.
Oh, there he is here. Thanks, Brother Tommy. who's been so magnificent in terms of making sure that students of color are treated with dignity in the philosophy department. But of course, like anybody else, he holds us all to the highest standards of excellence. And we're going to be in Florida together with this magnificent conference that you're putting together. Brother Will knows what I'm talking about. Both of them teach in my class, African American Studies. So to be able to just set them loose intellectually on the young folk and then have me running my mouth twice a week. That's part of what it is to try to be true to the best of what's going into the making of us as it connects to the works of Wilson and Drake and Kilson and Du Bois and Lorraine Hansberry and James Baldwin and others.
Can I say something really quick just about
please,
that?
then we have-
Because I think one of the things that we neglect is how we are not networked in the ways that we once were, so that you can, so that as individuals we can go into communities or schools and the like, but we don't have the same kind of deeply networked communities, so things often feel like they're one-offs they're really frequently, which is why, media winds up being is part of why it becomes so powerful. So the man who does the repairs on my house went on and on about the Reconstruction documentary, right? And said, I didn't get any of this in school. It is so exciting. He's not a young person. He's a man in his 60s, but it meant, right? And so everybody who he knows now will be, right? And so I think that's the sort of the tension.
Also,
Yep.
Elizabeth told me.
Yep.
And there's a man in this room who served in prison 28 years and introduced himself. And he said, we watched all your films.
Yep.
And I saw an interview the other day when the president said, that was their form of punishment. Got to watch PBS for your sins, and they made him watch all these black.
That's wonderful.
Is our brother still here? Is he still here? He was here earlier today, though, because I saw him in Norfolk when I.
We have a
Absolutely.
question.
He's a wonderful brother. He's a brilliant brother.
We have a question up here.
Lady in the blue. How much more time?
I don't know, I think we're over, but I'll let them, this conversation is good, so I'll let it go.
And thank you for the opportunity to ask this question, because I've been struggling with myself basically all day on whether or not to ask this question, but I think it's fundamental to the discussion today and the theme of being in both a golden age and a cataclysmic age, because I've been speaking with my friend who's at the Kennedy School here about this. So this is a very real question, even though no one wants to open themselves up to being asking the least intellectual question in a room full of great intellectual people. But has American democracy fallen? Because I believe that the reason why people are not lined up like never before to participate in an election, which is a matter of life and death literally for not only Americans, but for people in the Caribbean, people in Africa, people in Colombia, is because people on the street level recognize that democracy, American democracy, which analytically, America's never fully been a democracy, but it has fallen, hasn't it? I really want to hear from the panel. Has American democracy fallen? And what do we do in the face of that true cataclysm?
Thank you so much for that question.
You all want to jump in on that?
Oh my good. I'm glad you answered it in a way towards the end where you said it has not really been a real democracy from the start. And I think that's it right there. It's like, it's an experiment, we keep saying. But the fact that some people were not allowed to vote, I still talk about that in class, that you still had to have 3 amendments to get black people to have rights, and still questions of voting rights had to be put in place via Voting Rights Acts and so on. That's a fundamental of any kind of democracy. Exactly. So essentially, we have to be real about what really happened, or the extent to which the advances that meant to really create a democracy are being, systematically withdrawn again. And I think that is the question that you're raising. But I think you've answered it really well already by even making that last statement that you made. So has American democracy fallen? Did we really have a full democracy ever? And I think that is the big question. And I think the essential answer to that is actually disturbing. But it's also, it gives you a real truth. And for me, I mentioned coming to Howard in the 70s and so on. Migrating to the US as a student and then working subsequently in different contexts was part of a promise that was taking place, a rise of challenges to a system to improve, make better, not just in the US, but around the world. And I think many of us, even people like me who came to school at that period and learned from activism and all the other ways that we, and in and out of the institution, part of all of that excitement about learning and growing is really disappointing in a sense that one feels that has been lost, so it's going away. And I think hopefully we can push past it in this next framework, but it's very disturbing. And the question of exporting this model to other places, also very dangerous.
No, I think we had to just acknowledge that democracies are very precious and they're very fragile and they're very difficult to sustain. And see, for black folk in the United States, you have 244 years of white supremacist slavery, another 100 years of neo-slavery called Jim Crow and Jane Crow. So that our conception of how we fight, our conception of a willingness to tell the truth and seek justice cannot be predicated on a utilitarian calculus as to whether something has fallen or not. If your child is crying and you love your child, you don't have a utilitarian calculation. You're going to do everything you can for them. That's what great-great-grandmama did for us. They didn't say, will slavery be overcome this generation? She just kept loving her children anyway. Same is true with Jim Crow and Jane Crow, you see. Because the powers that be, if you look up as a spectator, it always appear almighty. But if you're in the trenches, it's just mighty. It ain't almighty. And you're making movement. See, hope is a verb as well as a virtue.
That's right.
And so you got Afro-pessimism escalating, which is real in terms of talking about what we're up against. But if it adopts a spectator perspective and not a participant, then it's deodorized as opposed to the funk. There ain't no funk in spectatorship. You got to get in it to win it, to work with it. You see what I mean? That's our spiritual tradition. That's our spiritual tradition. If people had looked back at Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman and say, dang, I made it one time. Should I go 18 more times? Harriet, you lost your cotton picking mind. I'm going because I love these people. And you watch me. Then she got her Bible too. Now, we ain't going to get theological at this point because the Muslims can do it too. Jews can do it too. Buddhists can do it too. But in Harriet's case, she got Jesus. Something is motivating her beyond the utilitarian. And that's very important. And my hunch is we could ask Brother Howard, and then when you all took off in 1969, it wasn't a utilitarian calculation, was it? Is that right? Brother Howard? I said, when you all took off in 1969, it wasn't no utilitarian calculation thinking that somehow you got enough evidence to allow you to infer that you're going to make a breakthrough. Absolutely. That's exactly it. That's what we talking about.
So,
part of the same tradition. I'm sorry to interrupt like that.
we are in fact over time, but we hope that you will indulge just two more questions. This has been such a fruitful discussion, so I invite my sister here to ask a question, and then we'll have one more.
Hi, everyone. My name is Rugi Diallo. So we talked today about faith. You can't do the work of liberation without faith. And so one place where there is faith is with the activists. And so we talked about scholar activism. What about activism scholarship? Activists and scholars, I mean. Where can scholarship be done only in the institution of the university? Can it be done outside? And that's something maybe that I would like Aurora to speak about too, because I think that the people that you work with are scholars, become scholars, and so can we do more of that work? What would it take?
Great question, thank you.
Yeah. We're gonna get the other one? Are you gonna get the other one? Or should I answer? Yeah, definitely, thank you for your question. Definitely we can do that outside of academia. We work with a group of women, marvelous group of women, the Association of Chontaduro. They are leaders, women leaders, and we developed this program for them so that they can go to the university without having a BA or without having any degree, and they just collaborate with our research. At the end, they get a certificate from the university, and it's so moving to see these adult Black women saying, I don't have any degree, but I have one degree from this university. And he says he is one of the best universities in the country, and for that it is important to get the degree. And then we work with them, articles and books, and it's so amazing to see the new concepts they come up with. They are so much more rigorous developing concepts than many of us that were trained in very strict universities and in very strategic universities. So the women mentioned that we were doing that, and that what they do is that later on they go to the streets to work with women just like them, that were on the streets before we were working with them on their project, and share with them the books and the documentaries. So definitely you can do that outside of academia. And now the university is changing so that we are integrating these community groups that are writing books into the system of the university. So we hire them as professors of the university, even they don't have a degree, formal degree, so that they can teach about, for example, Vicenta Moreno, she developed this concept of the lived ethnography. And she goes and talks to Black women in the streets. She writes their stories. And now she's a professor at the university, and many other women. So the interesting part of this is that we hire one professor, but in the classroom you can have 15 women teaching. And the experience for students is amazing because they see a completely different set on the classroom. And also the women from Bohajá, going to Bohajá in Chocó is more expensive than coming to the United States. So we realized that bringing students and colleagues to the field was an enormous financial, So we decided to hire them as researchers of the university, and the results were amazing because they don't receive minimum wage. And with the salaries that they receive from the university, you can see the community changing, how everything moves around. It's so strong to see people having basic things that they were not able to buy for so long. So what they are teaching us how to change the structure, the economic structure, so we can see the students now going to college and getting access to healthcare at the same time that they are writing new books, they are writing new articles that are very rigorous. We have won several awards for this because we're combining what they call in Latin American Studies Association rigorous research with activism. So definitely we have examples in Colombia that can help us to think through this.
So our final question will come from Drake, who's a student here at the college.
Yeah, so I'm a second-year undergraduate, and this question is something that I've kind of been struggling with and trying to explore. I mean, since my first semester, it's really birthed from some coursework I did in Professor Hinton's class, as well as Professor McCarthy in the back, and actually some engagement with To Shape a New World, which was edited by Professor Shelby and Professor Terry. So, I mean, as we, it's well documented that, really particularly the criminalization of Blackness and simultaneously the criminalization of other, brown and people of color in this, has been embedded in the social psyche, around the world, but particularly in this nation. And what we're seeing now and have seen for a long time can be described as, right, a broken moral compass that's just, in a sense, running rampant or predominant. And so I guess my question, and something I've been trying to explore for a long time, is like, while we are committed to these institutional changes and, helping better the position of Black and brown people in this country, systemically, how can we also work to fight to kind of push back against this criminalization that is, even in Paul Butler's, text, in this Black criminalization that both white and Black people, are experiencing? How do we push back against that and also work to shift that moral compass through our scholarship or our activism or, whatever else that we're trying to do to better our position? So.
I don't know. I wish I did, because I would be trying to do it. I do think that what lots of folks have already said is really relevant, though, to tell the truth, to operate with a deep sense of commitment. And I also think, to ask, I'll be completely transparent. I had this, and I wrote about it, but I had this moment in 2016 where I said, my mother was born into a white nationalist state in Birmingham, Alabama. And I was born in that same place just a little bit after the formal white nationalism of that state. And I said, we are here again? I don't know if this is worth investing in. All these generations, all the death, all of the struggle, is this what we should keep investing in? I don't have an answer to that, but I think asking the question is important. I also became very honest that I don't have hope as an article of faith, that I have it as a praxis. And I think there's a moral imperative, particularly when you bring children into the world, that you practice hope even if you don't necessarily feel it. And so, and I say that because, these efforts that I think you so beautifully said, wanting to change this, and I feel like a lot of my work has been about sort of trying to change the way people think about things. I cannot say with any confidence that any of it is going to be successful, though, and I have to confront that as part of the endeavor, right? Because at heart of all intellectual work that is attempting to transform the society is the imagination. And you have to be able to imagine even the thing that you can't see. So to go back to the Harriet point, everybody who escaped, all the black folks who left plantations to fight in the Civil War, there was not an ability to actually see in real terms what might be, right? It was an act of the imagination made real. So that's all I got.
And I think the beautiful thing is that you're a young brother, so you got some joys coming your way in life, just like you got some pain. And Henry Highland Garnett, first time black people ever constituted themselves as a civic community at the National Civic Convention. He stood up on one leg and he said, black folk never confuse our situation with that of the Israelites of the Old Testament. For us, Pharaoh is on both sides of the bloody Red Seas. Then you can hear somebody say, can somebody sing a song, please? Can somebody just conceive of the impossible? That's how Sun Ra started his concerts, right? Black people have tried everything possible. We're going to try the impossible. Come with us on the mothership. For 2 hours, you're going to listen to an orchestra that's going to take you somewhere. And George Clinton did the same thing with the mothership. Take us somewhere, Aretha. Take us somewhere, Donny Hathaway. Take us somewhere, Martin. Take us somewhere, Malcolm. We don't see any possibilities. 1969 Harvard. Do you think 50 years from now they're going to be celebrating this magnificent department in 1969? No. Take us somewhere just like Sun Ra. Take us somewhere just like George Clinton. We getting on the mothership. But you got to sacrifice. You got to love. You got to learn how to empty yourself. You can't be cowardly. You can't try to fit in and be well adjusted to injustice and well adapted to indifference on that mothership. Curtis said, keep on pushing. Get on the train. Don't need no ticket.
Just get on board.
Just need a whole lot of courage and love to get on board. He's trying to get us to do the impossible. Yeah. And here we are talking about what was impossible, possible. But it's still a context in which so many of our precious brothers and sisters catching hell. Yeah. And it looks like nowhere else. It's a train of coming. That's the history of the best of black people. History of the best of folk in Europe, but especially black folk. Coast to coast. And now it's going to be planet to planet because we got planetary consciousness. But the point is, in our own lives, because you got biographical time, you got historical time, you got cosmological time. Now, cosmologically, it may be just the cockroaches. We don't know. But historical time, we only got one life to live. So then we say to ourselves, can we rededicate and fortify ourselves to the best of what the folk did in the past who looked around and didn't see no options at all? and kept loving us and kept sacrificing for us and kept telling us how brilliant we are, whether we were or not, kept somehow giving us a sense of possibility when our whole lives are so closed in. Skip know that in West Virginia. Ain't nobody expected this Negro to be sitting here like this in no goddamn West Virginia. Look at it. Yeah, exactly. But you ask Paulina, I know he gonna do it.
She didn't know where Harvard was, but she knew I was going to be somewhere.
Yeah. You got a question?
I want to add something very brief.
Add it, my brother.
We can determine. We're not bound by the current circumstances and where the country is, and even as
That's right.
back to white nationalism again. We have to face in two directions. We have to ameliorate the effects of past and current racism on our people. That is not only legitimate, it's necessary. We have to do that. But the energy that we feel in this room is such that if we decide to, we can determine the future. We can plot it out. We can determine a strategy to get there. A department like this could be critical to having people come together and figuring out what to do and to take it on as a mission. So we have to look in both directions.
Absolutely.
Fix what they've done, but also change the conditions so that our spirit is in control.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. Let's join me in thanking our panelists for this amazing discussion one more time. And thank you all for the generative conversation.